Welcome, everyone, to the Breakwater Mega Embassy Church. We are going to continue in our investigation, our excavation of history, looking into the origin of the Gospels, especially Matthew's Gospel. And today we're going to make an excursion, a sortie into Mark's origin. So, like I said, 45 years ago, a young Bible student, I was doing a term paper on the origin of Matthew's Gospel, which I thought would be really easy. But at the end of all my studies, all I can conclude as a result of the modern research that's available was absolute confusion. So it ends up being Matthew didn't write it, Matthew wrote it 50, 60, no, Matthew didn't even write it, but it was written 50 to 80 years after Christ by two authors, by a community, by a committee. And it's like at the end of the session, I said, I don't know. But that was back in the 1900s, and now there's a lot more access to information that's available, even online, digitally. When before, the only way to test a theory was to actually go to some secret theological library somewhere and search out books. But now we have a lot more access, and there's a tremendous amount of information so that we, common people like ourselves, can go and verify the claims that we find in commentaries. So let me pull up this summary that historically, 100% unanimous, Matthew wrote the first gospel in Aramaic. And of course, that is challenged ever since the late 1700s and the Enlightenment, when naturalists and Enlightenment philosophers decided that the gospels were just a useless bit of mythology, and they attacked it from that point of view and flip-flopped everything in history so that now Mark becomes the first gospel, and Matthew was written, like I say, up until AD 110. And one of the early records we have is from a bishop who tells us that Bishop Papias said, and everyone in the world at that time agreed that Matthew wrote the first gospel in Aramaic. Why not? It was the language of the Jewish people. It was the language of Jesus, the language of the apostles, the language of Palestine, language of all the Jews in the East. Why wouldn't you want it in your own language? All right. So the first thing we want to know is that this statement by Papias, bishop, it's not a guess. He's going, I don't know, maybe let's guess Matthew wrote that. It's not an assumption. It's not an opinion. It's a unanimous tradition that he got directly from the disciples of the apostles. Papias is not wrong. He's not mistaken. He's not confused about the canonical Matthew. That means the one that we have in the New Testament. There's only been one gospel of Matthew. There hasn't been a small gospel. There hasn't been a proto-gospel, an gospel, a loose collection gospel of Matthew. None of that exists, only in the fantasy of modern scholars. The only gospel of Matthew that exists is the one that everybody has in their Bibles throughout the entire world. We also learned that Bartholomew had a copy of Matthew's gospel to take on his first missionary journey to India. That is a matter of history. He had the Aramaic gospel. He left it there. And in the 2nd century, a guy named Pantaenus, who is the headmaster of the school at Alexandria, went on a missionary journey, found it, and returned it back as a treasure of the Alexandrian church. So what do you do with that? You have to disparage it, dismiss it, reject it out of hand, which is crazy, in my opinion. And I'm going to say that all the apostles had a copy of Matthew. Why not? And Peter would have a copy of that. What do you think? You think there's only going to be one copy? No, they're going to make hundreds of copies. The whole purpose of it being as short as it is, so it's easy to copy, easy to translate, carry with you. So Peter had a copy of Matthew's gospel as his preaching text wherever he went. It's apostolic doctrine. So it's little wonder that Mark's gospel replicates Matthew in his brief gospel summary, Mark's gospel, very brief, 16 chapters. We know that every apostolic father in the West quoted the Greek gospel because they spoke Greek, which had to be translated from Aramaic. It's unbelievable to me that it's a scholarly consensus that the first gospel was written in Greek. I'm not opposed to that, but it has to be translated since the language of Jesus is Aramaic. So even if there is the very first Greek gospel of Matthew, it by necessity must be a translation. Jesus didn't preach a Sermon on the Mount in Greek. Jesus didn't speak from the cross in Greek. Jesus didn't preach to the masses in Galilee in Greek. So if you have it in Greek, it's a translation, which is not a problem. It's easy. Josephus wrote his entire War of the Jews in Aramaic for the Aramaic-speaking Jews throughout the entire world. Then he had it translated into Greek. Was that a problem for him? No. Why do we assume it's such a problem for a very small 28-chapter short letter, actually, to be translated into multiple languages? It wasn't. So translation from Aramaic is a necessity, just because that's the language of the Jewish people. We know that Pantaenus had an Aramaic gospel. We know that there's clear history, a chain of history to the 7th century in the famous library of Caesarea, where the Bereans, the Nazarenes in Syria still use it. Syriac, Aramaic are all the same language. And we also know that Jerome translated the Aramaic Matthew into Greek that he had at the library in Caesarea. No problem. Is that a problem? So you think about Matthew's Gospel, 28 chapters. That's shorter than 2 of Paul's epistles. How long does it take Paul to write an epistle? Immediately. As soon as there's a problem in the church, he wrote an epistle. He didn't wring his hands, worry about money, worry about where he's going to get papyrus and ink and pen. He just wrote a letter and sent it to him. How long did that take? I showed you this before. This is Jerome's authentic commentary on Matthew's Gospel. Jerome tells us in here that he wrote this in 2 weeks. Look at this. It took him 2 weeks to not only write this, but to edit it, to correct it, and to publish it. 2 weeks to do this. Can you imagine? Handwritten. Probably on papyrus, maybe later on parchment, which is more durable because we still have it, so it must have been written on something durable. Look at that. Can you imagine him dictating this? He said he had a full crew of people. He'd dictate to one guy, and then he would send it to another station where they would edit it, and then they send it to another station where they correct it and finish it up. And we have it. How hard was that? 2 weeks. It is a monstrous fabrication to believe that the apostles would not publish anything until Mark, a non-apostle, published his small gospel. They want us to believe that. They want us to believe that. Beside the fact that the Aramaic Bible continues to be used to this day in the Eastern Syriac churches, they still use it. An unbroken chain. They say, we got it from the apostles. Oh, no, you didn't. I know more than you. History says, and Matthew's gospel is in circulation soon after the resurrection of Christ, which is 25 years before Mark was composed. So really, there's no compelling reason. Source criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism are not good reasons to reject history. All right? Those are subject to opinions of people, most of which have no interest in defending the portrait of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Does it make sense to anybody? So, in spite of this clear voice of history, Enlightenment scholars have succeeded in popularizing the priority of Mark, even among conservative Bible scholars. So, if you go to Bible college today, you will learn Mark, and priority. Go on the internet, you study anything, they're just going to say, well, modern scholars today assume that Mark is the first gospel. Then on and on they go. And you discount Matthew completely, which is the opposite of the way it is in church history. So I have a ancient Christian commentary here, Mark's Gospel. There's not one commentary on Mark that has come down from history. This has to be compiled from lectionaries, from sermons, from other things, from many, many different sources and many different people, which makes it extremely valuable and really a fun and great read. So they got little bits and pieces in here from Ephraim and from Augustine and from Tertullian and Origen and a bunch of other people that verse by verse. But the point of this is that Mark, if it was first, would be the gospel of choice for everything. But it's not, ladies and gentlemen. It's not. And we love Mark's gospel. But we have a choice to make between what history says and the new theory, which personally, I'm just going to consider completely wrong. And I'm saying there's not a synoptic problem, it's a scholarship problem. It's a starting point problem. So if you start in the wrong place, you end up in the wrong place. The synoptic problem, which is looking at the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So this problem didn't become a problem until the late 1700s, and it was created by Antichrist deists and atheists to cause confusion and disorder in the church. Yeah. You rarely find commentaries that talk about Jesus anymore, or what Jesus said and what Jesus did. It's mostly about the modern historical critical method, Q, and all the other things. And this is a double setting. This is double historical setting, and whether or not this is in the Gospel of Thomas. And it's like, whoa, unbelievable. So the synoptic problem we want to know is rooted in an antichrist agenda. We looked at this in previous sessions. You can go back and look at those up yourselves. But it begins with people who are definitely, absolutely opposed to anything in the New Testament that has to do with Jesus Christ being the Savior and the Son of God. All right? So, there's not one theologian, bishop, church leader that contradicted Papias. Okay? And then they all have their own traditions that they add. We've looked at those things. So we're moving on. We want to look at Mark's gospel. Everyone agreed that whatever the logia was of Papias, it is the gospel of Matthew. And if you're honest, scholar today, you would agree that what Papias is talking about, the oracles written in Hebrew, it is the gospel of Matthew. Every single person in the world, every expert and text critic in those days knew that Matthew wrote first and the Greek version was a translation. All right? So we have choices to make, whether we stand with the apostles, the bishops, the apostolic tradition, the textual critics of the day, or choose Hermann Reimarus, Griesbach, Paulus, Lockman, Bauer, etc., Boltman, Debelius, on and on. For me, in my house, I'm going to agree with Origen. I accept the traditional view of the four Gospels, which are alone undeniably authentic in the Church of God on earth. So if that's the wrong answer on the test, I prefer to get it wrong. So let's see if we can look at some of the origin of Mark's Gospel today, ladies and gentlemen. All right, where are we here? Oops, had this queued up at the right place. I'll find it. Bear with. We're getting there. So close. All right. So, on this session, after we recap that and look back, Mark's gospel. So, we learn that Mark is a cousin of Barnabas. Barnabas is the one who salvaged Paul's ministry. Paul was sent out, gone for 10 years. Nobody knows what he was doing until Barnabas went and got him, brought him back into ministry. And Mark, the author of the gospel, accompanied Barnabas and Paul for a short time in that missionary journey. So, skipping ahead, history records that Mark was also in close relationship with Peter the Apostle, and that Mark wrote his gospel while Peter was preaching in Rome. So, in the NIV Study Bible, there's notes to help understand the background and the history of each book of the Bible. So, let's look at this one. This is from the NIV Study Bible on the introduction to Mark's Gospel, okay? So we looked at this before in the previous session on Matthew's Gospel. Let's look at it right now. So there's no direct internal evidence to authorship. In other words, Mark doesn't say, I, Mark, write this like Paul does, all right? However, they say now check us out, it's the unanimous testimony of the early church that this was written by John Mark, okay? And the most important evidence comes from Papias, who is the bishop that we've heard so much about as the first extant or existing record, the oldest that we have. Okay? And so all of a sudden now, what the early church thinks about the Gospel of Mark is important. Okay? When it has to do with Matthew, it's not important. He's confused, he's wrong, it's disputed, we doubt it, he could be mistaken, wrong, on and on and on and on, right? But for Papias' statement about Mark, it's okay. We can keep that one. So we learn that Mark was a close associate with Peter, and that the tradition that he shares did not come to Mark as a finished product. In other words, we'll look at this, but the tradition, the gospel tradition of Mark write down didn't come to him on a piece of paper. It came to him as the preaching of Peter, directed to the needs of the early Christian community. Now that's interesting wording right there, because normally what the secular people say is that the needs of the church created the environment that required this embellishment of the early non-messianic Christ to convert him with all these legends and forms into the super apocalyptic Christ that we find in the New Testament. Okay? But what we find in Mark's gospel, if he is directing it to the needs of the early Christian community, that it's almost 100% the gospel of Matthew. All right? So what do you have? You have faithful preaching of the Word of God without any embellishment. That's what you have. So this idea that the needs of the early church and the suffering of the church required this new Jesus that they created, whoever they are. All these forms and legends, this form criticism, these source criticism, created this super Jesus of the New Testament. 3, Mark accurately preserves this material. It's important we understand that. We're looking at it a little bit, maybe too much. So, the conclusion drawn from this tradition, where did we get this tradition? Not only beginning with Papias, but everybody else, as we've already seen, right? So they're saying this tradition's good. All of a sudden, the tradition's good. All of a sudden, history's good. But not when it comes to Matthew, because they need Matthew to be jettisoned, thrown out of the boat like Jonah, right? Throw the man overboard. So the Gospel of Mark largely consists of the preaching of Peter arranged by John. Okay? That's important. We'll come back to that. It doesn't largely consist of the preaching of Peter. It is the preaching of Peter. 100%. There's only one source for Mark's gospel, and that is Peter. All right. So now we come back to Papias. We've looked at him enough, so we can kind of skip him to a certain degree. If you're just joining us, he's very early on. The Apostle John is still alive for another 20 years at least. Okay. In this very particular part of the world in which Papias is the bishop of the church. So Papias is not some lightweight. He's not some small guy. He's risen to the top levels of church leadership in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. And he gives us this information. He's also a contemporary of many people that had access to apostolic information. He tells us that if anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I question him. Who are the elders? Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, James, John, Matthew. What did they say? Or any other disciples of the Lord? Okay? He's still early enough in the first century to have access to people who actually knew apostles and other disciples of Jesus Christ. How important is that to anybody? So this is many voices that he is relaying. He's not making stuff up. He's not guessing things. He's getting it from the apostolic tradition in the first century. And then the NIV Study Bible says it's the unanimous testimony of the early church. Okay? The early church. And this is the most important evidence. It's not the most important, it's the earliest. The evidence is the same all the way through. There's no difference in the evidence. But it is important because it's so ancient and it comes from a guy who's well connected. Yeah. All right? Yeah. How can you dispute that? Who are you to dispute that? If you have better information than Papias, we would believe you. If you were closer to Christ and the disciples of Christ than Papias, we might believe you. But how does somebody in Germany in the Enlightenment all of a sudden question Papias, who gets his information from disciples of the Lord? And how does that become popularized? I'll never know. So here's what Papias says. Okay? Mark was the interpreter of Peter. Now, why was Mark the interpreter of Peter?
Why was he?
Yeah.
Because he was there with him?
He was a very good writer, wasn't he?
What's an interpreter?
Oh. So he...
Mark is bilingual.
Mark
is bilingual, at least well enough to be an interpreter.
Yeah.
Peter, Aramaic guy fisherman from Galilee, humble. Aramaic's a mother tongue. If he's going to go into a foreign country and preach the gospel to foreign languages, it's good to take translators with you.
Oh, yeah.
Everywhere we go in the mission field, we take translators. Yeah. 3 and 4 translators, 3 and 4 languages, 2 languages. You depend on your translator, your interpreter, to take the message and to craft it culturally and to make sure it gets communicated properly. So now we find that Mark is traveling with Peter and he writes down accurately whatsoever he remembered. Now, this is a culture with highly trained memory skills. It's how you went to school. People can even do it today if they work. If they work at it, you can remember things, believe it or not. It was not, however, in exact order. And this is important for us, and we're probably going to pound this until we get all the blood out of this little turnip here. Okay, so he wrote accurately, not in order. The sayings, the logia, the deeds of Christ. Now he's telling you why there's a problem with the order. It's because he didn't hear the Lord or accompany him, so he can't know the chronology of the life and ministry of Jesus because he wasn't a follower of Christ. Right? So that's one reason. Are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we went on a trip to Yosemite one time. I mean, I've been there so many times, and then I take pictures. Right? Back in the old days, remember when you took pictures, you had to take them in to some place to have them printed for you. Remember? You had to take your roll in, write your name on it, take it to Costco, put it in there, and come back. So I had all these pictures from Yosemite one year, and Irma put them in a photo album. So she put all the waterfall pictures in one, and then she put all the hiking pictures in one, all the river pictures in the sections. And I'm looking at that and going, you know what? This is chronologically wrong because we didn't do all these waterfall trips on the same time. We did this on day one, and this was this day, and this river picture should be here. And if I organize these chronologically because I was there, I would organize them differently, but she wasn't there. So she put them thematically, which doesn't mean it didn't happen, did it? No, we still went to the waterfalls, just didn't go like this. But that picture of this waterfall is true and accurate. There's no problem. There's the picture. We're there, but it didn't all happen the same day. Okay, does that make sense to anybody? So you have this portrait of Jesus that Peter's been painting, but Mark has no real awareness of how they fit together, except that John the Baptist is here, crucifixion, resurrection is over here, right? And then we traveled to Galilee, and then we went to Jerusalem, and he died on the cross, and there's that week that we enter into. So you can have a certain feel for some of the chronology of it, but the exact order is not possible, especially since Peter accommodated his instruction to the necessities of his hearers. And if you've ever been on a mission field, you've ever done preaching anywhere, you always accommodate your message to the necessity of the hearers, to the moment. And you never give a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings, very irregularly, unless you're in a class and you're doing a gospel study or something and you want to take them through. But that's very rare in a spontaneous event when you're out preaching to people. Okay? So he's going to say this. He's going to defend Mark. Mark made no mistake in writing as he remembered them. Okay? He took special care not to omit anything that he heard, which I'm sure he did omit things that he heard, simply because you're going to hear too much to remember. All right? Doesn't have a Sermon on the Mount. Can you memorize the Sermon on the Mount? No. Did you try it? I tried it. It was like really hard. Yeah, I'd leave that out too. If I had to just write the gospel right now from memory, I think I could do a pretty good job. Not the accuracy that Mark had, of course, who I believe was under the ministry of Peter, who had Matthew's gospel, right? And preached from it. So he didn't omit anything and he didn't add anything. Now, according to the new theory, everything is added, right? And fictitious. Everything about Jesus, supernatural, the miracles, the resurrection, the atonement, all of that is fictitious. So Papias said, no, there's nothing fictitious. The content is good, all right? It's the chronology that has a problem. So here's the rationale. The people in Rome wanted a copy of Peter's preaching. So Mark, around 60 or so, some say even earlier than that, he wrote a summary for them. Hey, give us something. We want to study Peter's teaching. Okay, so he wrote it out. 16 chapters, just like that, no problem. A guy who's not even an apostle, just a follower and apostle, was able to replicate almost 97% of Matthew's gospel verbatim. Excuse me. Now, who is a better source for the teachings of Jesus than Peter? And if Peter wanted to embellish the record, could he? Who's got more stories than Peter, right? I mean, if he really wanted to go out of his way and he really wanted to extend this thing and make up stories. No one can be better than Peter. Peter can make up all the stories he wants. Who's going to contest him? Right? But he's not. Matthew, Mark, and Luke show the exact same picture of Jesus Christ. There is no difference. There's no increasing embellishment of legends as we move on from Matthew to Mark to Luke, ladies and gentlemen. So, could German scholars 1,800 years later know more about Jesus than Peter? Could the LA Times or National Geographic know more about Jesus than Peter? Do you think Daniel Brown knows more about Jesus than Peter? Peter's an eyewitness from the inner circle. Peter was a witness to the crucifixion, the resurrection. He was alive when Mark wrote. And Papias says he wrote down accurately, not in exact order. So two things. Accurately, not in exact order. Okay? Now, why is this important? It's important because Mark's gospel should really be called the Gospel of Peter. What do you say? By calling it the Gospel of Mark, it kind of separates from the source of that gospel. He just wrote it down. He's like a secretary, right? He's like the guy that's helping Jerome write his stuff. He's a stenographer, an amanuensis. All he did was copy Peter's sermons from memory like a secretary, like a little student. Okay, did a great job under the anointing and the power of the Holy Spirit. We're grateful for that. Now, this gospel is 16 chapters, which is about the size of some of the epistles, right? Romans is 16 chapter, 1 Corinthians 16 chapters. So it's like one of Paul's letters. Not that big of a deal, not that hard to do. And Papias defends the content and the authority as from Peter. So Papias is going to stave off criticism of the chronology or the order by reminding his readers of the origin. Okay? You have ancient text critics. What does that mean? People who read Mark's gospel, the text, the manuscript, and go, hey, this doesn't match the order, right? Content's good, order, not so good. So Mark's gospel, when you look at it, section by section, doesn't match up with a standard that they're using to measure it from. All right? Is everybody clear on that? And Mark wasn't attempting to be meticulous in his chronology. That wasn't his point. He wasn't an apostle. He wasn't one of the earliest followers. He didn't have firsthand information of the chronology or order. He wrote it like Peter preached it. Okay? Mark made no mistake. This is what Papias said. Okay? Not fictitious. So it's not in order. Now, F.F. Bruce says his aim was to record in writing what Peter had to tell the works and words of Jesus. Okay? So Mark doesn't make any mistake in this. He's just trying to do the best he can with what Peter says. All right? That's good. Good effort. Right? I'm not going to find any fault with that. So when we look at the concern of Papias, he addresses two things: content and chronology, right? But what's his concern? What's Papias' concern? Is Papias concerned about the content, or is Papias concerned about the chronology?
Not the content.
He's not content. He's concerned about the chronology. And everybody knows, any text critic of the day knows that he doesn't have the proper chronology, which means it's some of the stories are set in a non-chronological framework. He doesn't criticize the content. Content's good, right? It's authoritative. It comes from Peter. Which is to say that, how does Papias know that Mark's content is consistent? What is he using as the basis to determine that the content agrees with the universally received tradition of the gospel. Because there's heretics at this day who are making false gospels and are preaching false doctrine. All right? Tons of heresy going on right now.
Yeah.
So in terms of fending Christianity off from the Gnostics and the heretics, they have to know what the content is that they're dealing with. All right? So he says content's good. This is not heretical. It's not Gnostic. It's not a fake gospel. It's not something, even though it doesn't have the genealogies, doesn't have the birth narratives, it's still good, starting from John the Baptist and God. So what this says is that the content agrees with previously established views about Jesus. This is to say, ladies and gentlemen, that Mark didn't make up a new Jesus as is taught by the modern secular movement. Okay? That Mark took these forms and these legends and he made this Jesus into the super Jesus we find in the Bible. And then Matthew took that and Luke took that and off they go to the races. Okay? We've already talked about the fact that the Jesus of Mark's gospel is exactly the same Jesus that's preached throughout the world by the apostles to turn the world upside down. And then we learn that the chronology is not exact because, as we know, the oral proclamation in evangelistic or missionary work is not always presented chronologically. Can you agree with that?
Do you want
A little wawa,
tea?
a little water, just cold water. Okay, so we also find out that Papias doesn't accuse Mark of editing the sources himself for the needs of the church. All right? Which is one of the, thank you so very much, a cup of water in the name of Jesus Cristo. Okay, is this clear? So Pappy says Mark is recorded when Peter preached, not chronology. So he's not saying, oh, Mark's edited this so much. He's got so many sources. The needs of the church requires the super Jesus that we find in the New Testament. We need the apocalyptic second coming, miraculous, atoning sacrifice on the cross, super Messiah. Right? So if Mark is the first to do this, are you with me? If Mark is first, and Mark takes such liberties to create this non-messianic, non-resurrected, historic wimp, right, into the superhero martyr, wouldn't Papias have more to contend with than a chronological problem? What do you say? Yes. Yeah, tons more. So what this tells us is that Mark didn't create the new Jesus of the New Testament. It also tells us that Mark's portrait of Jesus agrees with the public knowledge of Peter's preaching and the existing universal tradition that's been accepted as gospel. You with me so far? Mm-hmm. So they're not accusing Mark of betraying Peter and saying, no, Mark, you're wrong. You know, Peter, you twisted Peter's words. He goes, no, you're accurate. You've done the right thing. It's accurate. Nothing fictitious added, nothing omitted to twist, right? You can omit things and it's just as bad as adding, right? Absolutely. So there is a universal tradition that's already accepted, already in existence, that's reflective of not only Peter's preaching, but apostolic preaching. And Mark's gospel agrees with commonly held teaching and previously written documents. Okay? Mark is faithful to Peter. Historically, then, the orders from Mark, the content is from Peter. Okay? Which exactly fits what our good bishop told us. So the question then is, how does Papias know, or anyone else that we have record of in church history, how do they know that Mark's gospel is not in exact order? What does that tell you? It tells you that there has to be an exact order from which Mark strays.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Light bulb. I mean, how else could it be, right?
Yeah.
If you're saying you deviate from order but not content, you must have an established content. You must have an established chronology. And in terms of church history, the established chronology was Matthew's gospel. He already told you that. The exact order cannot be oral, because Peter's preaching is oral and it's not chronologically in order, right? So if you're saying Mark didn't write his chronology according to the standard, that standard cannot be oral, because he's writing oral. It has to be a written standard. Does that make sense to anybody? Yeah. Peter's preaching, it's oral, it's not chronological. How do I know that? Because there's an established written chronology, which could only be Matthew's gospel. It can't be anything else. It can't be a Q document, which is non-chronological. It can't be a proto-Matthew. It can't be an M. It can't be an L, T, R, all the other supposed sources that are floating around out there. It can't be a little fragment. It can't be a collation of Old Testament prophetic sayings. Where does all this come from? It comes from nonsense, absolute fabrication, mythopoesis, ladies and gentlemen. There had to be a previously received written or literary text that was commonly accepted, that had the exact order and content, right? Don't move. Boom. Oh, it's even large. Why not? Leave it like that. So Mark's written text, the manuscript, must conflict with a complete written gospel text. Agreed? Has to. Now, in some cases, Mark is chronologically harmonious with Luke. And John's gospel is not in the accepted order used to judge Mark's chronology. You can't use John. So who's left? If you can't use Luke and you can't use John, what else do you got left? You got Matthew's gospel, right? It's unanimous. And it's unanimous. Everybody knows that. He wrote it early. It was carried throughout the world, as we've seen, in all directions. And every country where the gospel went, they have the gospel of Matthew. Every single place, the same one. All right? Now, the heretics that twist it, yeah, even the heretics use Matthew's gospel as their authority. Okay? So there wasn't 5 different copies of small gospel of Matthew floating around that was later used by a community and edited 4 or 5 times and finally found its way into Matthew's gospel. We only call it Matthew's gospel because he wrote a little bit of it and there's a little fragment running around. And they said, oh, maybe Matthew wrote that. We don't know. So let's just call it Matthew's gospel to give it some authority. You're kidding, right? So, it's not that they're German, it's that they're anti-Christ scholars in the late 1700s. Flipped the switch on history. So today it's accepted that Mark wrote first, and Matthew, or someone, not Matthew, of course. If it's 80, Matthew's dead by then, so it can't be Matthew. I don't even know why they call it Matthew's gospel. These people, right? You hear what I'm saying? Why do you call it that?
What year did Matthew die?
Huh?
What year did Matthew
They all died early, because they went out to preach the gospel and they died. We can look it up. Maybe 60. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt to 80, 60. It's 20 years after he's dead. He's supposed to be writing his gospel. It's ridiculous. So in the late 1700s, you got atheistic, you got philosophical naturalists, using naturalism to undermine the confidence in the accuracy of the portrait of Jesus in the New Testament. The picture of Jesus in the New Testament was at war with these guys since the late 1700s, okay? And they cut the chain to the anchor of history. And so one of the big ideas that came out of this war was that Matthew didn't even write, and there's supposed to be this 30 to 40 year period between the time of Jesus and the first gospel of Mark. So if Jesus is 30 and Mark wrote 60, that's 30 years, right? So in this 30-year gap, before there was any written gospel, there's this lively period of competing ideologies and endless mythological stories about Jesus that Mark took and codified in his gospel. Okay, that's how it goes. This is now the anarchy of modern scholarship today, trying to organize in this lively period of all this nonsense taking place that's developing over 30 years until the little baby gospel of Mark from Rome. And then Luke and Matthew, two source theory, use Mark's gospel. And they furthered his imaginative and creative work. Okay? So what you have is Jesus is just a wandering Jewish sage, just a normal guy, told jokes at Greek dinner parties. Judas was his best man at the wedding of Mary Magdalene in Cana. And Jesus was not crucified. He went to live in India and is buried in Tibet. I have that book in my library. Yeah, unbelievable. So if history means anything at all, and unanimous history, it's not like, one person against the entire world. There's not even one person against this view. All of history, Matthew's published immediately, and it tells the truth about Jesus Christ from eyewitnesses. He died. He rose again on the third day. He lived on earth another 40 days teaching about the kingdom of God, ascended into heaven, sits at the right hand of the Father. Okay? Now, if Mark was written first and it becomes the literary exemplar, okay, if it's used by Matthew and Luke, it's the pattern, okay, as modern scholars now presume, Mark's chronology would not be in question. What do you say? If Mark is first and Mark establishes content and chronology, Mark's chronology would not be in question. They would question Matthew's chronology. Does that make sense to anybody? So if Mark is first, as they tell us today, Mark's chronology would be used to correct everyone else's, which is the way it's used today. So when you look at gospel parallels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and even John, with the synoptics, the first three, and John, they now key everything to Mark's gospel. I showed you that last week. And once you do that, then it throws off Matthew's chronology. But they're not using Mark as the key here. They're using Matthew as the key. Does that make sense to chronology? So they question Mark. So here's all the stories in Matthew. And this one doesn't line up with Mark. And Mark's got this one here. And Mark's got that one there. Mark's chronology is messed up. That's what they're doing. Okay? So this little simple statement by Papias is so profound because it tells us that there's a complete gospel narrative that existed prior to Mark from which his chronology deviated. And as I said, it can't be Luke because Luke did use Mark. Luke often follows Mark's chronology. Again, it wouldn't be John. Papias tells us why. Mark recorded the oral extemporaneous preaching, so it can't be an oral record. And according to history, the only gospel that was written before Mark is the Gospel of Matthew. Unanimous testimony, Matthew first, the priority of Matthew, universal, acknowledged in church history. There's no reason to give that up. Okay, so this is redundant. We remember what Papias said about Matthew. Matthew wrote the gospel in Aramaic. Everyone translated them as well as he could. That's exactly what we find in church history. This is the order. The only possible order that precedes Mark is Matthew's gospel. All right? That's the only one that is complete enough to be the standard. And it was the standard. Okay? All right. And history is clear. We don't need modern source critics, okay, to tell us anything about Mark. Mark's gospel arose out of the simple need for an accurate account of the life of Jesus as declared by Peter. Okay? That's what they say. Peter preached, Mark wrote what Peter preached. Peter the rock, the saint, the elder, the martyr, my man, my bishop. So here's the way the spin goes. 91% of Mark is repeated in Matthew. Why don't I have this? I think this is 97. Let's put that in there. So 97% of Mark's words have parallel in Matthew's gospel. Over 88% of Luke, right? Let's see. Which is to say, we don't necessarily even need Mark's gospel. And that's the way we find it in the early church. All right? But here's the point. In the new view, Matthew used Mark as a pattern. Okay? Mark's gospel is what?
1 second.
It's 100% Peter, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does Mark know? Nothing.
Everything from Peter. Everything from Peter.
It's 100%. And that means 100% Peter is found 97% in Matthew. So if Mark is 661 verses, 601 is Matthew, 60 verses are all that Mark has, different than not found in Matthew or Luke. Okay? So Mark's gospel is 100% Peter. So if that's the case, we can take Peter out of Mark's gospel and see Peter's contribution to Matthew's gospel. Does that make sense to anybody? Here's Peter 30 years later preaching almost verbatim the same thing that he contributed to Matthew's gospel. Are you with me? If this is Peter in Mark and you have 90% of that in Matthew, you see Peter's contribution to Matthew's gospel. Matthew didn't write this thing himself, right? Matthew's collaborating with many sources in his gospel. And Peter's one of those sources. So Peter's the only source for Mark. Peter's a source for Matthew. And Peter's faithful to preach the gospel as recorded by Matthew, even 30 years later. Matthew and Mark both have Peter in common. Matthew's an eyewitness. He doesn't need to wait 50 years to write anything about Jesus.
Yeah,
You kidding me?
Matthew's
So,
Matthew's as high as Peter.
huh?
Matthew's as high as Peter, like when you're talking about the apostles.
Yeah, they're buddies. So if you got Peter here in Mark, you have Peter here in Matthew, right? It's the same thing. But Matthew has Peter here. Hey, Peter, let's write down your opinion about this. So Mark is able, at the spur of the moment, because they said, hey, we want this thing, to publish a gospel from memory that was meticulous and accurate and faithful. Okay, he made no mistakes as to content. He added nothing fictional. But what's the modern view? Everything in Mark is fictional. Everything's an addition. Jesus is just a wandering wimp. He's a beta simp. That's a new word I learned recently. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't use that. So when we listen to Mark's gospel, we're hearing the voice of the Holy Spirit through the Apostle Peter. Okay? So the synoptic problem. Papias understood it. He's a textual critic. As we said, if Mark was first, Matthew's order would be the subject of debate, right? No one would find fault with Mark's chronology if Mark is first and used as a textual basis for Matthew. All right. Let's skip all of this. Let's skip all of that. So Mark's chronology, again, which is to say that the existing chronology can't be a loose collection of Old Testament Messianic sayings, right? That's ridiculous. It cannot be the mythological Q source because Q has no formal chronology, all right? So what are you left with? You're left with Matthew's gospel and the one voice common tradition. Okay, Matthew wrote first and early. So in order for this new theory to be accepted by the church, you have to reject and revise all church history. It's not even just reject, but it's dismiss and revise and revile. Let's get even a worse word in there, okay? And this new method, this critical method, beginning with enlightenment, just shreds the gospel. So here's what you have to do in order to make Mark a priority work. You have to say a number of things. One, Matthew didn't write first. That's the first thing that's got to go overboard with Jonah, right? The luggage has got to go. He didn't write for Jews in Aramaic. There is no early Aramaic gospel. Bartholomew didn't take it to India. Pantaenus didn't find it in India. He didn't bring it back to Alexandria and leave it in the library there, as everyone attests. The apostles not really sure who wrote the first gospel. In fact, none of them wrote down a gospel. And you have to say that the apostles didn't hand down tradition, that they didn't hand down anything. They never knew who wrote a gospel. According to the New View, Mark first, Matthew AD 80. Only John's the only apostle that ever wrote anything. So there's no tradition even to hand down. Why does Papias even have a tradition? Right? Why is there even a tradition? And the apostles are wrong. They don't know who wrote anything. And the early fathers unanimously didn't know that Mark wrote first. So there's not one, they just didn't know. They're wrong. All of them. And Mark's chronology is correct. It's revisionism.
Yeah.
Mark wrote somewhere around 60 to 70. Matthew wrote around 80 and used Mark. That's what you have to believe now. Jerome did not translate Matthew's Aramaic gospel at the library in Caesarea into Greek. That didn't happen. That has a mythological air to it. I doubt that. Do you want me to read it for you? Did I tell you in this session that Jerome wrote this in 2 weeks? His entire commentary on Matthew's gospel on probably paper from Egypt. Look at that, 2 weeks. He had a full force of people working for him. Isn't that amazing? Look at this thing, so beautiful. Such a wonderful thing. I love this thing.
It's amazing.
That we still have it, that it survived, and that we have it to this day. It's just phenomenal. Think about it. So in his commentary, Jerome says that he translated into Greek from the Hebrew language, which many call the authentic Gospel of Matthew. So here's Jerome. You read that? Fathers of the Church, St. Jerome commentary on Matthew, page 141, is comment on Matthew 12:13. He says he translated it into Greek. How hard was that? Not hard. And it's the gospel that Nazarenes and Ebonites use. Can you imagine? And many call it the authentic gospel Matthew. I don't know. So the Nazarenes, Ebonites, a city in Syria, which is Syriac-speaking people, they don't really use it. They don't have it. And that the Aramaic Christians in the East don't have the Aramaic gospel, right? And nobody had it. There is no Aramaic gospel. Papias is wrong. Justin Martyr is wrong. Pantaenus is wrong. Irenaeus is wrong. Tertullian's wrong. Origen's wrong. Jerome's wrong. Eusebius is wrong. Wrong. Or the modern theory is wrong. Take your choice. We have a choice to make.
Yeah.
All right. I'm sorry. Let's wrap this up. I'm just going to show you something here, okay? So in the Fathers, which is 40-volume set, but in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, it's not anti, it's ante. It means before Nicaea, before 325. There's so much material that has survived to this day that's written in this amazing period before 325. Okay? Volumes of stuff that's come down. Some of it's good, some of it's fake. But the fact is that this is a literary culture writing things all the time, not just in the Christian world, but in the Greek world, the Roman world, the Jewish world, and the world at large. Okay? Just because things don't endure for 2,000 years and come down to us doesn't mean that they don't have a full-on library and literary communities, creating stuff. Okay? 30,000 volumes of Caesarea. They say there's 250,000 at the library in Alexandria. There's libraries all over the world full of stuff. So in these Fathers, reprint 1994 by Hendrickson. Okay, Irenaeus quotes Matthew 260 times. All right? So in the back of the book, they're gonna put every scripture that Irenaeus quotes, whether they do an excellent job or not. At least he quotes Matthew 260 times, right? He quotes Mark 20 times. Now I looked those up. A couple of them are sketchy, but let's give him the full 20, okay? Which is to say what? Mark is not first. Mark is not the primary gospel. Mark is not your go-to gospel, okay? The Apostolic Fathers, which is a bunch of guys. They quote Matthew 55, Mark 5. Justin Martyr quotes Matthew 67. He quotes Mark 3 times. Okay? So if Mark enjoyed 15 to 20 years of common usage in the church before Matthew's gospel, wouldn't you expect the opposite to be true? Wouldn't you expect Mark, if it was in use for 20 years, from 60 to 80 to maybe even 90 or 100, all right? And Mark is the primary gospel that's used, and then Luke comes along, you would expect Mark to have more visual representation in the quotes by the Fathers. But we can see that the priority that Matthew's gospel held just in the quotes. Okay? Just in the quotes. Patristic quotes. All right? So here's what happens. Supposedly today, and they agree, this is agreement by scholars today, liberal and conservative, Matthew and Luke use Mark. 661 verses of Mark, 601 of them appear in various forms in Matthew. So they say Matthew used Mark. So instead of Mark being a summary of Matthew, they conclude that Matthew used Mark as a form of reference. I mean, that's just a conclusion. That's an opinion. All right? You have no evidence for that. You have no basis for that, other than the fact that they share a commonality. Right? So why can't Mark be Cliff Notes? I got through high school on Cliff Notes. What come first, the Cliff Notes or the book? Mark's are Cliff Notes. So Mesker says this, which we like him. Seem. What does seem mean? Is that definitive to you? Matthew and Luke seem to have depended on Mark's account. Okay, now we don't mind Luke seeming to depend on Mark's account because Luke says, I'm investigating this from every source, my witnesses. And so Luke and Mark are friends in Rome at the same time as Paul when Luke is writing his gospel and Acts of the Apostles. So there's no problem with Luke using Mark's gospel since it's approved as the content of Peter, right? Why not? Okay. So Matthew and Luke have these 235 verses, which are not in Mark, which they call Q, right? Which is the German word for source. And so they believe, they make this up. So it's a made-up document. This is made up. All this is mythologizing. And it's historically new, and it's unnecessary. Don't need it. Okay? Just throw it out. Throw it overboard with Jonah. So most of Mark is repeated in Matthew. Yet Mark is entirely dependent on Peter. What do you say? Mark and Peter, 100%. Yes. So we could just as easily say that Matthew depended on Peter as much as Mark did. They have Peter as the same source. They share Peter.
Yeah.
You think Peter forgets his story? No, it's in Mark's 30 years later, it's almost verbatim, right? It's parallel. It's amazing. Peter's consistent. Peter's faithful. Peter's not deviating. He's not adding. He's not embellishing. He's not making up stories. It's the same thing. Peter is the sole contributor to Mark's gospel. There's no such thing as a Q, R, M, L, or T in Mark. Not in Mark, which are all these fragments and little baby sources floating around. They're just floating around out there, and Mark took him and added them in. In Mark, we hear Peter. Okay? So we can read Peter's contribution to Matthew's gospel by reading Mark. Does it make sense to anybody? Mm-hmm. So what did Peter do for Matthew? He did the same thing for Matthew that he did for Mark, and we can read Peter's imprint on Matthew's gospel by reading Mark's gospel. All right? So Matthew is as much an amanuensis or a secretary of Peter as is Mark. So if Mark is a secretary for Peter, so is Matthew. Does that make sense? They're sitting down, they're collaborating, they're getting the story, they're putting it down on paper. Peter's sitting there, apostles around. Jesus is there in the 40-day period. Yeah. They're scripting this thing.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you say? Okay. Oh, yeah, let's remember that one. Jesus says, no, let's do that. So Peter's a source for both. Yeah. We don't need Mark in priority. We don't need Mark first as a source for Matthew because we have Peter. Okay? So if you think about Peter's contribution, when Jesus took Peter aside, remember when he rebuked him? Yeah. And he says, I took him aside and rebuked him. Get behind me, Satan. Who knows that? Only Peter knows that. And how embarrassing it is for Peter to have to go say that. You know, Peter's such an honest guy, right? Mm-hmm. To his own failing, you know. So remember when he sank on the stormy sea that night out in the sea, and it's a storm and the water's raging, and he gets all the way out there, and who knows what Jesus said to him, what he said to Jesus over this storm, except for himself, right? Mm-hmm. So he has to share that himself. Peter was present at the Sermon on the Mount. Most likely, neither Matthew or Mark were there. Luke was not at the Sermon on the Mount. So where do we get the information about the Sermon on the Mount? Well, obviously we get it from Jesus, but somebody has to record that, keep that, memorize it, and know what it is, right? So Peter is a possible source for that, or at least a contributing portion to that. We think about the fact that Matthew doesn't enter his own gospel until Matthew chapter 9. So where does Matthew get all this early information? Where does he get the information about the Magi? Where does he get the information about Mary and Zacharias and the birth narrative and all that? Where does he get that? Well, he's living in Jerusalem where Mary is there, right? Mary's a part of the early church. So he's garnering his sources also. So he's got much input. He's got his own eyewitness account, plus he's got all the apostles there, and even Peter's testimony, right? Wouldn't Peter be the logical source for his own conversion testimony? All those early testimonies where Jesus came and said, hey, come follow me, and all that early stuff.
Yeah.
So Peter's got all this information of early information. Who was at the transfiguration? Who's the source for that?
Peter, John.
Has to be. Peter has to be at least one of them. Peter, James, John. There's only 3 people up there. So when they got to come down, he says, don't tell anybody till after I'm glorified, right? So now they can tell you, which is to say that Peter, James, and John are a source of what happened on the Mount of Transfiguration. If you remember when they all went to sleep in the Garden of Gethsemane, he always woke up Peter, James, and John to have them pray for him, right? And everything that took place there in the Garden of Gethsemane, they were all there. They're a part of that. Peter's a part of that. Luke's the guy chopping the guy's ear off, right? Now, you remember Peter's denial? Peter denied Christ 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
Where do they get that story?
Peter.
You have to get it from Peter. I mean, I wouldn't even tell that one. I'd be embarrassed to say that, right? I'd leave that one out completely. But I mean, how honest, how humble is this guy, right? He did that. So Matthew's gospel doesn't depend on Mark's gospel. It depends on Peter, okay? A large part of it, okay? A large part. So you don't need Mark to explain the agreement, the literary agreement between Matthew and Mark, okay? You don't need Mark, because Mark is Peter. We have Peter. And regardless of Mark's sources, he's only a scribe. What do you say?
Yeah.
Both Gospels bear the common stamp of Peter, the church's early and most prominent leader. Okay? So let's see. Okay, we're almost done here. You still with me?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So Mark's Gospel is a brief summation of key events. That's what it is. It's bullet points of an already bullet-pointed gospel. Okay, the Gospels are already a summation, and he's even a smaller summation of that, and not used very widely in the early church, and no existing commentaries have come down to us, which doesn't say that they didn't exist. And they use Mark in commentaries. That's why we have the one I showed you, this one here. They've compiled this from multiple sources and lectionaries from the first 700 years. All these people. It's really great. I love it because you get so many different points of view. We've got a whole series on this if anybody's interested. So what we find here, according to this testimony, is that Mark is not a crafty editor creating this super Jesus for a struggling church. Did the church struggle? Yeah, but they struggled because of the biblical Christ, right? They're not struggling because of the wandering Jewish sage. The Roman Christians wanted a record of Peter's preaching. He accommodated them. It's that simple. It's not that hard, okay? Peter's not in Rome. Mark wrote from memory. I don't doubt that Peter preached Matthew's gospel. He replicated the exact words of Jesus from Peter's preaching. Not only is this the remarkable precision of a culture with highly developed memory skills, but it also shows this, and this is important, pay attention here, all you in the crowd. It shows that a secondary level, which is Mark, right? A non-eyewitness retelling of the gospel was not subject to free-willing embellishments. All right? So if anybody was going to spin the wheel on this, Mark could do it, except that these guys just heard Peter preach, so he's got to be faithful to what they just heard. But he's not an apostle. He's not an eyewitness. He's second level at least, but he's able to replicate the gospel from 30 years ago, almost word for word. Jesus, the Jesus of Mark's gospel, is the Jesus of history, and it's the Jesus of Matthew's gospel. And it's the Jesus that Peter knew, saw crucified, resurrected, and was willing to die for as a martyr. Come on. Last, side-by-side comparison. I'm going to show you this because it's kind of important. In Acts of the Apostles 10, we have a sermon by Peter. All right. So if we do a side-by-side comparison of Peter's preaching in Mark's gospel using Acts chapter 10 with Mark's gospel. Oh, I had this so organized so nicely. Oh, you know what I'm going to do? Don't move. Hold your breath. Everybody stay calm. Let's go down. Should we go down one more? Okay.
Well, Mark was a disciple of full.
Oops, I didn't do the whole thing. Did I not do the whole thing?
Mark was a disciple full of the Holy Spirit.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So he starts out in Acts 10. You can see this yourself. Where he talks about the good news of Jesus Christ. Begins in Galilee, the baptism of John. God anointed Jesus. He ran around doing good. They killed him by hanging him on a tree. He was manifest. He commanded us to preach to the people. Wonder how to get this back up here. Will that work? I'm not going to worry about it. Okay, everyone who believes in him, the gift of the Holy Spirit, he commanded them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. So if you look at this list, this brief summation of Peter's sermon in Acts of the Apostles, you'll see that it conforms to the chronology and the message in Mark's gospel. Okay, you might want to do this as an exercise for yourself. It's kind of fun to look at it that way. Mm-hmm. I see what happened. I made this really big print for myself so I could read it on the computer here. But I will send this to you if you really want it. So Mark's gospel starts out, the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's the way he starts here. He goes right into the Galilean ministry. You know all about John the Baptist and what Jesus did. Over here, he went around doing good, oppressed all, they healed by the devil. And then Mark records the healings and the miracles performed by Jesus. So as we follow this outline here, the Jerusalem ministry, the death, the resurrection, appeared to the chosen few, go in the world and preach the gospel, commanded them to be baptized. And then, of course, in Mark's gospel, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. Okay? So this ends this particular section, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this is meaningful to you.